One of the things about being Treasurer is momentarily you're the centre of attention, and I've got to say, when I was asked by the Victorian Chamber, got to move with the times, when I was asked by the Victorian Chamber to do a repeat of last year's event again this year, I said, but surely they're the same people, they've heard me speak before. I'm pleased that last year's budget went down so well that you've found the time and the opportunity to talk to us. And there's plenty good to talk about the state of Victoria. Of course, this wonderful publication that you've produced, Don, I think is really an outstanding illustration of the achievements that the Victorian Chamber and of course I think all Victorian employers have been able to achieve through their effective advocacy to the government. I think I would be accused of spin if I was to try to get away with only my achievements but not my shortcomings. But I do congratulate you on what I think has been a great outcome. Also today, I think I do have a few trepidations about speaking here today. Last year, you may have noticed I waxed lyrically about North East Link. Perhaps I can now talk a little more candidly about it, but I was pretty clear and direct with you about how I thought it was unfinished business and it made innate sense. It was a little bit trying when we saw that on the front page of The Age next day, but when you think about it, honesty is the best policy, and here we are making substantial inroads and a real investment towards achieving what hopefully will be a bipartisan piece of infrastructure for the community. But it also leads me to another observation I'd like briefly to make, and that is, of course, 125 journalists at The Age of the workforce at The Age have been identified to lose their jobs, and I'd like to pass on my sympathies to them. It's obviously going to be a very difficult time, and really the fact that I from time to time do get irritated by journalists is a sign that journalism works. It's a sign that in many ways we have to fight to preserve the need for an independent and a critical journalistic industry. The integrity of journalism, I think, is important, and the fact that they irritate politicians and ask us questions we don't like and report on wonderful achievements that you don't see as quite so wonderful, I think is a demonstration that you're doing your job. So democracy doesn't function without an independent and a robust press, and The Age has done an outstanding job over a very long period of time, and my sympathies are with all those people confronting where their future lies. So, enough of the intros. I want to thank you all for being here today. When the Andrews Labor government was elected less than 3 years ago, we made a commitment to the Victorian people, a promise to Victorians. We promised that we'd deliver better schools, better hospitals, better transport and more jobs. This budget gets on with the job of doing just that. Our investment in health, education and public transport are all about ensuring the livability and prosperity of Victoria. We're also delivering on our promise to implement every one of the 227 recommendations of Australia's first Royal Commission into Family Violence over the next 10 years. At the heart of this budget is an unprecedented and comprehensive, might I say, $1.9 billion package to begin to do that, and I mean begin. So this is the enormity of the task, that this is a start. But to put this into context, this is more money into family violence than has ever been put in any other preceding budget of the state of Victoria, and each and every one of those preceding budgets combined. More money than has ever been allocated to family violence. It is more money than every jurisdiction in the nation, including the Commonwealth, combined have committed in their most recent budgets to family violence. So this is enormous, but it's necessary. I said this will not only change lives, importantly it will save lives, but we have to get on and start with what I think is not only an important social change, it's a moral imperative for this government. When the government was elected in 2014, the Victorian economy was in the doldrums. Unemployment was nudging 7% and our economy was on life support following 3 years of ever-decreasing GSP growth. Since then, coincidentally, the rate of economic growth in Victoria has more than quadrupled, from 0.8% in 2013-14 to 3.3% in 2015. In fact, Victoria's rate of growth has continued to outpace gross domestic product, that is the nation's gross domestic product, since the government took office. I was asked by a journalist not so long ago, "You must be the luckiest treasurer in Australia." And I said, "Yep, the harder I work, the luckier I get." My favourite graph is just about to come up. Of course, strong economic growth often means attendant strong growth in jobs. Over 200,000 jobs have been created since November 2014, with over 60% of these jobs being full-time. This equates to almost 250 jobs being created every day since the government was elected in last year. More jobs have been created in Victoria than have been created in the rest of the nation combined. So an enormous achievement, and we didn't do it alone. And that's why it's so important that I'm here today. Business have been putting their shoulder to the wheel, employing and doing an outstanding job of it, I might say, for Victoria. Importantly, Victorians across the state are feeling more confident about their job prospects. The participation rate is now at its highest point since 2011, averaging more than 65% in 2016. Victoria's financial position remains strong, reflecting the government's track record of responsible financial management. The 2017-18 operating surpluses identify $1.2 billion in surplus, with surplus averages over the subsequent years coming in at $2.4 billion. Net debt as a percentage of the economy remains below the levels that we inherited from the previous government, and they will be no higher than 6% of gross state product over the forward estimates, so still below the levels we inherited from the previous government as a percentage of the economy. But perhaps more importantly, the fact that we've been able to keep those numbers low is a demonstration that we've also been able to make sure we're not living beyond our means. I've been out there advocating, I think for the last 18 months, that we need to have a grown-up discussion about debt, particularly at a time when we've got the lowest access to borrowing rates that this nation's ever seen. And I know that when Labor treasurers start talking about debt, some people get nervous, particularly party pollsters in the Labor Party, might I add. But we have to have this discussion, and it has to be a serious one about exactly when do we put our shoulder to the wheel and take the opportunity that is presenting itself to this state and this nation. So, yes, at the moment, I've brought debt down to about 4.6% of gross state product, enormous reduction from the 6.2% that we inherited. Every percentage point of debt is worth about $4 billion to the state of Victoria. So we brought it down quite enormously, but we need to bring it up. We need to actually start to leverage the whole point of a AAA credit rating. As I've said recently, what's the point of a credit rating if you're actually not using it to secure the lowest possible interest rates that you can, and actually secure the infrastructure that grows a community and builds the services that the community not only deserves but demands. So I think it is appropriate that we progressively move our debt ratio up to 6%. And I think today already, I think I can say this, Moody's have put out a statement saying that our strategy warrants the preservation of our AAA, and they'll continue to do the work around the recognition of the government's investment in these areas. So it's important, I think, that as a government we start to push people's predilections around recognising that governments have to make investments and we have to do it as quickly as possible. And if we don't, we're going to lose enormous opportunities. So our average expenses as a government are projected to come in at 3.2%, well below the projected revenue growth of 3.7%. So our revenue growth is essentially above our expense growth. So what that means is we're not spending more than we earn. And I think that's important. It's a discipline that I think is one of the keys to this government's success. If you don't spend more than you earn, you can make the case that utilising debt for economy-growing infrastructure is not feeding your output exposure, not feeding your recurrent liabilities. Keep them in check and put the money to good use to grow your economy and the infrastructure for the state. Importantly, however, I also think we need to recognise when people say, well, times are good and this government's had it easy, the average revenue inflows into the state of Victoria's budget over the last 10 years have run at 5.9% growth. 5.9%. I'm currently managing a budget with revenue inputs, revenue growth, coming in at 3.7%. And our economy is doing exceptionally well and our budget is in a very strong position. And I've been able to do it with less growth in revenues than most treasurers in the past. Our financial fundamentals are strong. They're consistent with our prized AAA credit rating, and we remain one of only 2 Australian states with a AAA rating from both major credit agencies. But strong surpluses and the responsible use of debt has meant that the government has been able to drive infrastructure investment to record levels. The 2017-18 budget forecasts the infrastructure investment will average at $9.6 billion per annum over the forward estimates. In 2017-18 alone, we expect to see more than $10 billion spent on productivity-enhancing infrastructure. To put that into some context, the 10-year average before we came to government, that the state of Victoria, its own money that it used on infrastructure, sat at $4.9 billion. So these are more than, of course, numbers on a page. It means new and upgraded schools, new hospitals, better roads and rail connection, and more trains and trams. It means more work for Victorian industry and Victorian businesses. And we've managed also to up our investment despite, might I say, the Sydney-centric Prime Minister who continues to deny Victoria its fair share of federal infrastructure funding. We're expected to receive only about 8.5% of allocated Commonwealth infrastructure funds over the next 4 years. 8.5% rather of all the funds on infrastructure that will be directed to the nation. So achieving the equivalent of, say, our population share, which is around about 25% of the nation's population, if we just got that, if for once we hit the mark of a fair share allocation on infrastructure, then we'd have $6.6 billion more to direct to infrastructure, and imagine how much more I could leverage of that $6.6 billion, supported by state allocations and supported by private sector engagement. We could well and truly make this state fly. So the Andrews Labor government is getting on with the job and building the projects that Victorians need. Our investment in health and education, in roads, public transport and jobs is also an investment in our people. in their skills, in their energy, and of course in their future. Whether it's the M80 Ring Road upgrade, the Gippsland Rail upgrade, the Booster Key suburban hospitals, or the new schools and refurbishment package across the state, all are critical to growing our economy, creating jobs and benefiting the community for years to come. Indeed, the record infrastructure investment that we're making in this budget and previous two is expected to generate more than 50,000 jobs. Now, it's not fair to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you think about that, this is a number that looks back and forward about what that investment creates. 50,000 jobs. The state economy, looking back, has created 200,000 jobs. So it's not fair for me to say that that's exactly a quarter of the new employment that's directly attributable to our infrastructure spend, but it's the closest measure that I can come to about what contribution we're making, despite despite the fact that, of course, it's not entirely accurate to say, but it's as good a measure as you'll get. So 1 in 4 jobs are at least in part a measure of exactly how much effort the government is going to. So that jobs growth also means more opportunities for Victorian business. Over the last year, the number of small businesses in Victoria grew by 15,000. That's a testament not only to the strength of the Victorian economy, but the innovation of a lot of Victorians. While our infrastructure investment helps drive job creation, this government understands that business is critical to growing the economy and creating jobs. This is a government that values our relationship with business. That's why I spend a lot of time talking to business. That's why when you ask me to do things in the context of improving your business operations through your peak bodies, we listen. In an Australian First, of course, we're reducing the payroll tax rate by 25%. 25% for all businesses operating substantially in regional Victoria. This will directly reduce costs for around 4,000 businesses and provide a direct boost to regional economies. It means that Victorian regional businesses will pay the lowest rate of payroll tax in the nation by quite some distance, might I say. We're also bringing forward previously announced increases in the payroll tax 3 threshold. Finally, we're reducing red tape for businesses by raising the payment threshold for businesses, and that'll mean that businesses can make annual rather than monthly payments based upon their payrolls. All of these measures will support employers to grow their businesses, encourage job creation, protect jobs and boost local economies. So I wanted to dispel the myth that as a Labor Treasurer we weren't at all interested in tax cuts, because apparently I've got a bit of grief lately about the government and tax increases. So I had this little graph prepared by the wizards in the Department of Treasury and Finance. In just 3 years, we've delivered tax cuts for business totalling $560 million, which is more than double what the opposition could achieve in their entire 4 years in government. So our tax relief measures include payroll tax cuts that I've outlined, as well as cuts to stamp duty on mobile plant and on agricultural insurance products. We want business to thrive in this state because we know that that's how you create more jobs. We need confidence in the business sector that this is a government that you can predict where it's going and you can understand its heart and its values. And of course, our values really lie at the heart of job creation. So we're making targeted investments to help a range of sectors. This includes investing $90 million to attract private sector investment in priority sectors, as well as making funds available to partner and with strategically significant manufacturers to manage their exposure to volatility in energy markets. And just to clarify that, we know that there is the movement from this country from domestic gas pricing to international gas pricing. It's peaking the price of gas, and the state will work with our big manufacturers to make sure that they are, to some extent, assisted as they make the transition away from their exposure to peaking gas volatility and gas pricing. And we've put $50 million into that process. We're undertaking extensive scientific, technical and environmental studies on the risks, benefits and impacts of onshore conventional gas. And importantly, what that means is that we will do a lot of the assaying work about what the asset, what the resource actually is onshore, so that industry, one, doesn't have to go to that cost and expense, and two, that the community can be assured that we're having a discussion about real issues. How much resource is actually there? Is it safe to extract? And we'll be led and guided by the science on this. We're investing $25 million for Visit Victoria to drive jobs growth in the visitor economy, something highlighted as a priority by the Chamber in their budget submission. Complementing this is over $300 million for sporting infrastructure and events. Businesses that are investing in new manufacturing and technologies will receive $5 million through the Future Industries Manufacturing Program and an additional $10 million for the Local Industry Fund for Transition. So $3.5 million will help support small businesses in the digital economy and deliver recommendations from the Small Business Regulation Review. And we're also supporting jobs in Victoria's agriculture sector by investing $44 million to protect Victoria's agriculture sector, as well as removing the 10% duty on insurance premiums for all agricultural products, including crops, livestock and equipment. The Andrews Labor government has invested a record amount in public transport to create jobs and get people home quickly, comfortably and reliably every day. Over $930 million is being spent to make sure Victorians have a more frequent and more reliable metropolitan public transport system. This includes the night network, which I'm pleased to say is here to stay, a permanent feature of our public transport system, and ordering more trams and delivering more services. And it's good to see that the night network is so successful and growing in popularity as time's going on that other jurisdictions in the world are starting to copy it. And we've sped up our level crossing removal program, which means up to 28 dangerous crossings will be done by the end of 2018, 8 more than we promised in 2014 and 21 more than we removed in the entire decade prior to that. Interestingly, at the time that we were producing the policy to remove 50 of our most dangerous and congested level crossings, I spent a lot of time talking to an industry that I have enormous regard for, the construction industry, and I said, how many of these level crossings do you think we'll be able to get rid of inside of 4 years? And they said, oh, at a push we could do 20. Well, they've exceeded my expectations, and for that I'm greatly in their debt, and I think the community also is greatly in their debt. But when you think of the enormity of the infrastructure work that we've thrown their way and their capacity to actually adapt and absorb it, bring in skills from other states and for overseas, it's just been phenomenal, and it's been part of the story that is the resurgence of the Victorian economy. And the sum of our investment, additional services to Melbourne, it'll mean, of course, that we've got a much more punctual and targeted service on our public transport system as the system matures and develops. It'll mean more safer and more comfortable journeys. And we're also investing to improve the train network across regional Victoria. Our Regional Rail Revival Plan, worth $1.5 billion, will be delivered if and only if the federal government gives Victoria the full amount that it's owed as a result of the lease of the Port of Melbourne. This will be the biggest revival of all time of the rail network in regional Victoria, and it'll create hundreds of jobs right across Victoria. The plan includes $435 million for Gippsland Rail, the first stage of the new Surf Coast Rail project, and upgrades to every major rail line. Better rail and public transport in regional Victoria ensures that communities are well connected and Victorians can get to where they need to go regardless of where they live. That's why it's time to give Victoria its fair share and also to invest in these projects that I know that the local members and the Federal Infrastructure Minister are very big fans of. It's hard to put a compelling argument against them unless, of course, it's something to do with mendacity. So we're investing about $2 billion more in our roads to get people home safer and sooner. This is on top of previously announced investments like the Western Suburbs Roads Package. $700 million will be spent upgrading the M80 Ring Road. This will complement the new North East Link, a project identified as a priority by Infrastructure Victoria. It's a missing link in our road network and it'll slash congestion in Melbourne's north, south and eastern suburbs. And we're spending over $500 million on regional roads to ensure that regional communities can stay connected. This complements an extensive program of resealing, resurfacing and rehabilitation works right across the state, work that will free up key freight routes, reduce the risk of crashes, relieve bottlenecks and improve traffic flows. The government is also taking historic action on family violence. Of course, it's an issue where everybody has a role to play, but importantly, it's an issue where government must lead. The budget allocates $1.9 billion to protect victim survivors, hold perpetrators to account, and help change community attitudes. It's funding that will establish a network of support and safety hubs, fund after-hours crisis support, and financial counselling and therapeutic support, and help build long-term social housing and modernise and expand crisis accommodation. And it'll do so much more. To enable the government to invest in priority areas including family violence, public sector departments will deliver efficiencies totalling $1.2 billion. We want to make sure that the government's efforts are focused on priority areas. Now, I know that this will be an issue of concern to many public servants, and I want to assure them that we'll deal with this sensitively, but let's put this into context. Every year, the state makes a very conscious decision. The last 3 budgets that I've produced have redirected 2.5% of all spend into what's called the government efficiency dividend. Now, that dividend is basically winding back the expenditure that we've historically put into those departments, so new expenditure, new priorities can repurpose those funds. So we're simply adding another 0.5% to that government efficiency dividend. And we've been able to do that by making sure that front-end services, service delivery quality has not dropped, and indeed in many areas, whether it's elective surgery or ambulance support, we've been able to improve it because we've been redirecting into those areas. But I do want to make the point that there was a choice for this government. We could have continued to run up expenditure. We could have gained more revenue by taxing the community, or we could have decided that this was sufficiently important that as a government that we would make the choice to redirect our effort and our emphasis of the money that the people of Victoria have already given us to manage. And it was a latter decision that we made, and I think it's the right one, because if this is serious, if we're all prepared to make a sacrifice and a contribution to address what is a pernicious element in our community, then we're going to have to do it by government leading, and that is government showing that we're prepared to tighten our belts in this process. So we want to make sure that government's efforts are focused on these priority areas. Also, $1.3 billion is being invested to ensure that we have the best teachers in our classrooms and the best facilities in our schools. It's an investment to make sure that every child gets the support that they need. There's $685 million for schools, for new and upgraded schools, bringing our total investment in schools over 3 budgets, just the capital investment in schools, to more than $2.5 billion. Over $200 million is being provided to make sure that young Victorians are being given every opportunity for the best start in life. From investing in maternal and child health services through to supporting students with disabilities, we're making sure that student by student, school by school, brick by brick, we're building the education state. This government has already invested more than $5 billion in the state's healthcare system. This budget further delivers $2.9 billion to ensure all Victorians receive world-class care. It'll mean our emergency departments, our intensive care units, our medical health practitioners, maternity admissions, palliative care facilities and ambulance services will all get the funding boost that they need. We're providing $1.6 billion to ensure that Victorians can get the best of care when they need it. And the results of our continued investment are showing. At the end of the last financial year, the elective surgery waiting list was the lowest it's been in 6 years. On the capital side, we're investing $429 million in our hospital infrastructure across the state to make sure that Victorians have access to high-quality facilities wherever they live. We're also making a range of investments across the board to boost medical research, cancer screening, and ensure that our health system can respond in a timely manner to emergencies. And we're boosting access to mental health services across Victoria with $407 million to meet our most urgent needs. Now, this budget also commits $2.4 billion in community safety measures. Together with the 446 police that we've already funded, Victorians will enjoy the safety and protection of more than 3,000 extra police officers. We're also replacing 10 police stations across the state. The record investment, of course, is part of a broader overhaul of the justice system that focuses on early detection and prevention, as well as punishing serious crime in a way that is commensurate with community expectations. Over $600 million will be spent to build and to strengthen youth justice facilities and also improve security around high-risk prisoners. And the point I'd make about the growth in our police force is that this government and previous Labor governments are the only governments who funded and delivered an increase in our police numbers. I think if you add all of those numbers up, it comes to about 7,000. Yes, the previous Conservative governments have been the beneficiary of that funding and the long-tail delivery of recruits, but it's only Labor governments that actually fund more police. So this budget delivers more services, more job creation and stronger communities all across regional Victoria. $4 billion is being invested into regional Victoria, and this represents the single biggest investment in regional Victoria in the state's history. It's being invested in schools and hospitals, in road and rail, in community facilities and community organisations that are really the heart of why more and more people are choosing to move to and live in regional Victoria. We're investing $311 million in more new regional trains and 39 new velocity carriages made in Victoria, for Victorians, by Victorian workers. $531 million will be spent on upgrading and maintaining regional roads and bridges to improve travel times and safety. $45 billion directed to digital access and to reduce black spots in regional communities. And we're making a targeted $47.8 million investment into Ballarat to bring 600 jobs to the regions, effectively decentralising government services, establishing a government hub in La Trobe Valley, which will bring 150 government jobs to the region. And all of this on top of other initiatives that I've already flagged, like our regional payroll tax cut, our regional public transport investment, our investment in regional schools and funding for health. So when we were elected in 2014, we were upfront about what we stood for. This budget really is just a reaffirmation of the values and the priorities of this government. What you see with this government is what you get. What we said we'd do, we've got on and done. In fact, every one of our election commitments have now been implemented as a consequence of funding in this budget, with two notable exceptions, which are dependent upon joint federal funding. They haven't been met. So we will do what we said we'd do. We'll honour our commitment to the Victorian people. And what I think is important is that we're getting on and delivering the infrastructure and, more importantly, the opportunity that this state needs. And we can't waste time. Our population growth, our growth in economic activity all demands that we should make sure that we're successful in delivering the bounty of Providence and making sure that we can lock it in for the future. So there's more to be done, and we're getting on with the job of delivering for all Victorians. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to, just in a general sense, you mentioned that you were asked about whether you're one of the luckiest treasurers in Australia. You'd certainly be one of the happiest. $8 billion worth of surpluses stretching over 4 years. You've done 3 budgets now. Is this the most enjoyable one you've handed down?
Well, every one of them is a joy. They're not a joy in the development, I can tell you. Especially in a Labor government, I've got a lot of very ambitious ministers that I've got to deal with. The great thing about them, they're incredibly smart. They've got great plans, and it's my job to cut those plans to the bone in many ways. So I'm the guy that has to say no. I can understand for many of them it can be quite a frustrating process. Why am I not being prioritised over somebody else? So somebody actually has to make it all fit together. We have to keep honest to the fiscal parameters that we set, and those are the guiding rules that I basically use to frame the budget. Run very healthy surpluses, don't spend more than you're earning over a budgeted period, and make sure that you keep debt below the level we inherited. So making that all fit basically tells us exactly how much that we have to spend, and then the hard work begins between the Premier and I deciding how we cut that up. But I'm told that I should look a lot happier than I am. And please,
I read that Matthew Johnston of the Herald Sun, who I think might be here today as well, described you as being very glum in the media.
This is my happy face.
My God, what's your sad face like?
You don't want to know.
Before we get to some really irritating questions, from a treasurer's perspective, what's the worst thing about budget week for you, other than, I guess, doing the rounds with Neil Mitchell the day after?
I'm not sure I should be admitting this in the context of the press being present, but the bit I really don't like, the part that's the hardest, is actually doing the press conference immediately after, in the press lockup, immediately after the budget's been revealed. Because perhaps I should admit, I don't know every line item in the budget off by heart. There are 5 volumes of it, and the press all go through it and they find one particular line item and they want to talk about it. I have to at least present the image that I know all of these numbers. I think I might have carried it off this year. We'll have to get a mark out of 10 from the press at some point.
I would like your questions, please. It's most important you get a chance to ask the Treasurer about any concerns, issues you have. Please When you do so, raise your hand. There are a couple of roving microphones, and please state your name and affiliation. No statements, please. We only have a fairly limited amount of time. While we wait for those questions, going to the regional rail network, you tossed around words like mendacious, but isn't it wrong for the state government to get regional communities' hopes up by promising these rail networks when there's absolutely no guarantee there'll be federal money coming through?
Oh, well, that's why we've been absolutely clear that this isn't happening unless the federal government are making a equal contribution. Like, we can't have been any clearer every step of the way. And the reason why I think it's important is, look, there's $1.5 billion that's due to the state of Victoria as a consequence of an agreement not signed by this government but by the previous Conservative government, which basically said you'll get 15% of the value of the asset. It's not like they're gifting us money. We're converting a dividend yield provider to the state of Victoria, money that we would have got if we'd have kept the Port of Melbourne as a state asset, into a company taxpayer, which is money that the Commonwealth get. So they offset that transition by giving the states 15%. It's actually less than it's actually worth, but 15%, who's quibbling, will take it. And what we've been told by the Commonwealth is we were too late, they didn't expect we'd get so much, and quite frankly, they need to tell us where we should spend the money that is due us. Well, they didn't do that with the state of New South Wales, as they tend to have a different rule when it comes to their dealings with Conservative states as opposed to Labor states. And look, I'm a politician and I can deal with the brutality of politics, but what I can't deal with is efforts to what I think are nothing short of constraining the economic opportunity of this state. So when I was on Neil Mitchell today and I said that I thought that the federal government were deliberately attempting to stymie the economic opportunity and the growth of the state of Victoria, I mean it. And look, I don't anticipate that the Commonwealth will change the habit of a lifetime. I think they will continue to try and shortchange Victoria. I really wish that we could forget about East-West. At some point, you know, they've got to get over it because the state of Victoria is bigger than a single project and the people of Victoria deserve their fair share.
A lot of motorists haven't forgotten, though, about East-West.
Well, I think there would be an argument between many motorists. As a former roads minister, I know a lot about East-West, and I also know that certainly all the advice that went into the government at the time was that you need to build your second river crossing before you start talking about eastern connections. And of course, North East Link could well do a substantial amount of that load. But who in their right mind builds a road when you've got a business case that says you're only getting 45 cents back in the dollar, or that the project was actually going to cost $10 billion, not the amount that you told the public? And simply, I put it this way, that sooner or later, as a state, I can listen to all the lectures that the federal government want to dole out about producing business cases, but I'll just remind Victorians that they are prepared to gift a former Liberal government with $3 billion for probably the worst business case I think that has ever been produced to deliver a piece of infrastructure.
Any questions from the floor, please? Please raise your hand. There are a couple of microphones hovering around the room. It was a very big slideshow. There's certainly got to be a few questions out there. While we're waiting for that, tourism. I speak to a lot of tourism operators as part of our show, and just going around the traps in Victoria, we have some fantastic tourism attractions here. Close to $25 billion, or right on $25 billion you mentioned going towards Visit Victoria. Is there a case, though, to up that, because it's becoming an increasingly competitive market domestically to attract people to Victoria? Major events can only do so much. Is that something you'd look at in the next year?
Well, I think certainly our view about Visit Victoria is the funding that we've announced is for 2 years only. So we want to basically see how effective that is. And talking to the new chair of Visit Victoria, Paul Little, and of course the Minister, they've made it pretty clear to us that they want to get into this early and they want a substantial allocation in the first year so that they can subsequently assess whether or not the strategy is working. A lot of the effort will go into, can I be brutally frank, advertising in the other states, because we think that our brand has become, well, a little bit less than front of mind in the other states, and we're not attracting the same sort of interest and visitation that we should be getting. I'm keen to see how that plays out, and I'm also keen that the government can support them if they can demonstrate that such a strategy is working.
Yes, we have a question straight ahead, yes.
Jane Den Hollander, Deakin University. Minister, I'm married to a West Australian. It's the first time I've heard you say that Victoria gets a better deal than, a worse deal than Western Australia. I'm going home to tell my husband that, who's convinced that, in fact, they get the worst deals. My questions are about regional rail. Congratulations. The university is headquartered in Geelong. Of course, we're totally self-interested. Getting people in and out of Geelong safely is important and regularly, so well done. You informally assured me that there's Wi-Fi on those said trains, and I assume that you're going to look at all the bleak spots between Melbourne and Geelong and beyond, where we all fall out and drop in and out all the time, and the productivity cost is incredible. I'm going to take that as a given. I wanted to ask you one other question. Minister, you didn't mention universities. The universities in this town give you the best export dollar that Victoria has. I think it sits third in the nation. What is your view in the longer term now in terms of what will happen I assume that the government is going to take a position on some of that to keep the education state going, and how that is all going to fit in with the federal government's view and your own view. And I wondered what your observations might be, given we are destined to probably become the education state of Australia and beat the New South Walians.
Well, there's a lot in that. Firstly, can I congratulate you on your choice of a husband, and just hope that I assume that means you're bankrolling the relationship. Certainly, I can't help but feel that that's what Victoria's been doing for the rest of the nation for quite some time now. Recently there, of course, was a change of government in West Australia, and I caught up with Ben Wyatt, the West Australian Treasurer. He's a lovely bloke, and he was explaining to me that West Australia was being hard done by, and I said, the thing about West Australians is you are all a bunch of unreconstructed mendicants. You might change political colour, but your tune never changes. And look, I don't want to be in a position where I say I don't actually disagree with the idea that horizontal fiscal equalisation, that is, sharing the bounty of the wealthiest states to help those states that are not doing so well, is something that Victoria should oppose. We don't. I mean, fundamentally, quintessentially, what Australians are about is a fair go, and it means making sure that those poorer performing states do get a handout. And Victoria and New South Wales have been doing it. New South Wales not as long as Victoria. We're the only state in the Federation that has subsidised Federation since its inception. So we're good at doling out funds. But I will make a further observation. I think that increasingly, if we're going to look at mendicants, we've got to make sure whether they're worthy mendicants or not. And West Australia, and might I say other places, the Northern Territory, need to start thinking seriously about how they reform their economies the way that Victoria and New South Wales have done to make them modern, outward-looking and efficient. So, now that I've got off my soapbox, your first question was, you were trying to verbal me on black spot funding. Can I say it is a disgrace, really, that we're in a position where you can't, your mobile phone, your mobile connection can drop out between Melbourne and Geelong. I didn't believe it was true until it happened to me, and I've been traumatised ever since. Part of that requires us to work with Telstra, principally in terms of the black spot allocations, but there is a considerable increase in our black spot allocations. It requires us to have an agreement with Telstra about where they will go and how they will move to remove those black spots, but to make us more attractive as a state to Telstra to make their investment, we put more money into the pot, and we're also doing a lot more around Wi-Fi connectivity. The next question really was about the education state and how we're going to get there and how we're going to continue to assert its future. Well, we've honoured all our Gonski obligations essentially. That is Gonski Mark 1, 1.0, not 2.0 or whatever it may be, not Gonski Light, not Gonski into the distance or Gonski with the wind. We're talking about real Gonski, and we've met our obligations. If you look at the government's own funding documents that they produced on Gonski 2.0, what it says is that they would spend $6.3 billion less than Labor has pledged over the 4 years to 2018-2021, and $22.3 billion less over the 10-year period to 2027. So it's Gonski light, all right, and I think we can have these arguments as long as we want. I mean, the fact that the Commonwealth are proposing to make a larger contribution, that's good, happy with that, but let's get serious about this. If we're talking about trying to have a step change in terms of funding, then all governments have got to stop playing smoke and mirrors with this and get on and make the requisite funding. Now, we've been a sole contributor to Gonski since we've been in government. Every year our Gonski obligations have been met, even though we've been one part of a two-part act that doesn't seem to want to dance with us. So it's unfortunate, but I think increasingly the Commonwealth have to recognise that this is not about a nice media event. It's about the dollars and where you put them to get the outcomes that grow this community and give every kid every chance to succeed in the future.
We've got time for one or two more questions. Yes, we have a question. Tim Pallas. Hello.
Yeah, hi. Treasurer Tim Pallas from Inside Story. I want to take you back to that matter of the disagreement with the Commonwealth over the 15% infrastructure bonus. It was no secret that that scheme was going to end on the 30th of June 2016. Joe Hockey said that in his original press release back in 2014. So you knew that you were going to miss the deadline. Just in the privacy of this room, among close friends, you must have had conversations with your federal counterpart in the lead up to June 30th about what would happen when Victoria missed the deadline, as it obviously would. Could you enlighten us on what was said between you?
Well, I'm going to disappoint you here. No, we didn't. But also let me be very clear with you, Victoria did not miss the deadline. We actually sent correspondence to the Commonwealth. I think it was in May, might have been March, May of that year. I think they subsequently went into caretaker mode because of an election, which is the reason that they were unable to agree with us before they effectively decided to terminate the scheme and say everything was finished. We saw the deadline coming, we put our offer back to the Commonwealth, and that was it. So let me be very clear, we met our deadline requirements, we put a clear offer to the Commonwealth. They decided to get involved in the business of politics and call an election. That wasn't our making, that wasn't our choice, Tim, that was their choice. That rendered them unable to complete their side of the obligation and have a negotiation that concluded the discussions. Not our fault that they decided to go to the people and go into caretaker mode, but putting aside the who did what to whom, let's get back to basics here. What's at issue? Whether or not the state of Victoria should get the 15% that Joe Hockey told every state premier and treasurer, you can have this money, and jovially he said, and you can put it to whatever you want, provided it isn't sports stadiums. That's what he said, whatever you want, provided it isn't sports stadiums. So we haven't put it into sports stadiums. We're still waiting for some clarity out of the Commonwealth about whether or not we can apply money that is our just desert for doing the things that the Commonwealth asks us to do. So, I mean, we can play these games as much as we want. I'm getting old and tired and cynical as a politician. All I want to do is build infrastructure that will grow our community. And I just want the games to stop so that the Victorian community cannot be held hostage to the political football that seems to be infrastructure at the moment.
Time for one last quick question from anybody before at the front of the room here, Nick Rees, who I'm sure will keep the question very brief because we're just about out of time.
Not sure my answers have been all that.
Thanks, Treasurer, on an excellent third budget. Great to see you have grown so well into the job of Treasurer. When people talk about state tax reform, they invariably come back to the Holy Grail, which is the replacement of distortionary stamp duties with a broad-based flat land tax. In the last couple of years, we've seen the ACT Labor government move on this. As a reforming Treasurer, do you have any plans to go for the Holy Grail of state tax reform?
Well, I just want to make one point. You know, Canberra is special. A lot of very special people who live in Canberra, but not a lot of real people live there, in my opinion. And I just wonder how brave governments can be if we get to a point where we would essentially be saying, and there's a lot of merit in what you're putting, but I just want to put a break on people's expectations here. I mean, there's a lot of merit in saying transfer a one-off hit on stamp duty to something that you can manage through your ownership of property. But to do it, you'd have to hit every private property in the state. It would effectively mean that I would be taxing every householder in the state, and it would be, I think, subject to a considerable scare campaign from the opposition, and I think it would generate genuine fear in the community about what this new tax was going to be used for. So politics is the art of the possible, and it's also, in my view, about making sure that you can deliver on people's expectations. We didn't seek a mandate for such a tax, and I have no desire or expectation that will be part of this government's agenda.
And as the MC's prerogative, I get to ask the final question. As a fellow Western Bulldogs fanatic, do you want to tip the winning margin over Richmond on Saturday?
I was actually at the game on the weekend, so I went up to Canberra to see it. Just flew up for the night and flew back. That's how well prepared we were for this budget. I wasn't particularly well prepared for some of the umpiring decisions. I already had a go at Gill about it. I mean, I still don't get the deliberate out of bounds rule, but
nobody does.
But look, I'm prepared to stick my neck out and say the Bulldogs by 5 goals. Got a few coming back this week.
We'll hold you to that. I just want to say firstly, I'll come over here. On behalf of the Melbourne Press Club, I'd like to thank the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry for co-partnering on what has been another fantastic event. We look forward to this Unity ticket continuing for many years for these post-budget addresses, and hope to see you back here next year, Tim Pallas, if you're still Treasurer, which I assume you will. I haven't heard anything.
Have you heard something?
Politics is a volatile business, Tim, as you know, so anything could happen. Thank you very much for coming and sparing some time. It is a very busy few days after the budget. Many, many years ago, I covered federal politics, and the then Treasurer, Peter Costello, boasted that he didn't touch a drop of booze during budget week to keep himself mentally alert, doing interview after interview, speech after speech. I don't know whether you share his iron discipline, but that's a very good answer, because we were speaking on our table there about Tim Pallas's great love of fine whisky. On behalf of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, a bottle of traditional Japanese Mars whisky, and just one thing, don't drink it all at once, okay? Please, ladies and gentlemen, please thank Tim Pallas.